So I think we can get started. If anyone else joins, that's okay. Everything is recorded anyway. So hello, everyone. Glad to see you all here. Today we have the second lecture of our little intro to debating series that we're doing. My name is Milda. I'll be the one giving the lecture today. And we'll be speaking about the very foundational rules and skills that you have to debate. So specifically how to understand different motions and what are the first steps that you take when you get a motion in training or in a tournament, specifically how to define certain words in motions, how to create models and what they are, and how to frame the debate. There will be time for questions after I finish the presentation, but if at any point something is unclear or I should expand, please feel free to tell me. So the first thing that we can talk about is just what are motions? How do you interpret them? So a motion is basically a topic that you debate in the round. It can be phrased in several ways, but usually it starts with this house. So who is this house? That kind of changes based on the motion. Usually you can just imagine it as the state or a group of neutral actors, we as a collective. Other times in specific motions, it is a specific actor, but that will always be said to you. For example, this house, as a school teacher, this house believes that the US should ban fracking. So if this is the specific phrasing of the motion where a specific actor is said, then you have to debate from that actor's perspective. But we will talk about these kind of motions a bit later in the presentation. A lot of the times, what you will also get alongside the topic is an information slide. So here, they're kind of a paragraph of information that you need to debate the round. And any information on this specific slide is assumed to be true for the debate. Sometimes information slides contain just regular facts or info that are helpful to teams when constructing their arguments, specifically in motions that perhaps are more complicated, about topics that general people maybe don't know that much about. Or also information slides are helpful in hypothetical motions, but you don't need to know about that now. There's also two types of debates that usually happen. So the first type is value judgment principle debates. So here, a lot of the times we might debate about specific rights, human rights, group rights. So in these debates, we're thinking about whether a given statement is true in the majority of cases, whether it's good or bad. Likely, you will need some sort of metric or evaluative criteria to prove that something is good, bad, or true. And of course, this kind of debate can have discussions over the practical impacts, not only the principled considerations. The second very common type of debate, perhaps more common specifically if you're only starting out, is policy or action debates. So here we're just talking about changing the world in various ways. Should action X be implemented as a matter of law? Think about various debate motions about banning certain things like drugs or prostitution. Those are very basic types of motions. So you have to assume in these kind of motions that whatever the motion is proposing is not the status quo, basically, because the team that is in the affirmative side, the proposition, what you learned last time, is always kind of trying to change the world and explain how they will change that. And proposition fiat exists. I will explain what that is in the next slide. So all debates are a variation of these two types, but maybe worded in different ways. And each wording carries it a specific nuance. So actor motion, like in the last slide, you saw this house as a teacher would do something, versus non-actor motions. So this house would ban drugs, non-actor motion. Models/policies are not mandatory. So once again, we'll be talking about this later, but basically models are just kind of explanations about how would you implement a specific change. In many motions, specifically this house would ban things motions, models are quite necessary. In other motions, they're not. So once you get some practice and you see this presentation, you will start to get intuitions about where models are beneficial and where they're not very useful. So what is that proposition fiat I mentioned in the last slide? Proposition fiat is basically that all teams understand that the action specified in the motion is assumed to be possible. And this cannot be contested because otherwise the debate simply wouldn't work and it wouldn't happen. So it basically means that if I am proposition and I'm debating this house would ban drugs, everyone in the debate, both teams, understand that I have the fiat to actually ban drugs. It might not be fully perfect, like in most applications of many laws. Things don't work perfectly, people still break laws. The penalties for breaking laws aren't perfect either, but at the end of the day, we assume that I can ban drugs, right? Same as this motion, this House would reserve 30% of seats in parliament for LGBTQ plus candidates. So here we assume that the reservation of seats is a policy that would actually pass parliament. We know that in many countries it probably wouldn't realistically, right? Because there's many people opposed to these things, but for the purpose of the debate, we assume that it would happen. What does the motion not assume is that the seats will be allocated in a way that would actually benefit the community. It does not assume that there will be no backlash from conservatives. So these are things that opposition can fully argue, but they shouldn't contest that the policy wouldn't work, because otherwise there would be no debate. So what can opposition do? And what if you get opposition? How would you have to approach that? So it is generally not mandatory for opposition to have counter models in the debate, meaning if proposition bans drugs, you don't have to have your specific alternative to how you deal with the drugs. You can just argue for the status quo. It might be strategic for you to have one. It's up for your team to decide that collectively. It all depends on the motion and your strategy. If you do choose to have a counter model, your counter model must therefore be, number one, mutually exclusive, so different from props model, and it shouldn't have or shouldn't use more resources than the proposition. Of course, we're not going to count like how much money implementing a model costs. We're kind of abstracting and thinking about these things intuitively. But, you know, if proposition's model uses a small amount of resources, opposition's model cannot like use all the money in the world and everyone's buy-in to do whatever they want. You have to kind of be on equal ground here. Some motions may be explicit on whether opposition has to set a model and what kind. So, for example, this House believes that X should do Y instead of Z. opposition must defend Z here, and proposition should defend Y. What are the burdens of teams? When the motion is not worded as an absolute, proposition has to prove why it should be done generally, not beyond reasonable doubt. And opposition should prove why it should not be done generally. When the motion is worded as an absolute, so you can see the examples basically of how the phrasing differs in those two scenarios. Proposition should prove in the significant majority of cases why the motion is good and should be installed. And opposition should prove in the significant minority of cases why that's not the case. Opposition cannot win on one instance, for example. So now we will go through the most common types of motion phrasings and what they mean and how you should approach them. The first type is "this house believes that." So, by the way, most motion phrasings begin with "this house," as we talked about it earlier, and then whatever letters follow means different things. So this one is "believes that." There's a couple of variants here. Number one is a principal debate. So here we usually don't need a policy setup or a model, but of course it may be useful to illustrate with policies what would this look like. Some examples: this house believes that parents should have access to their children's social media accounts. So here we're not about changing the world. We're not about actually implementing this policy, but we're about evaluating whether this is a good thing. This house believes that the war on drugs has failed. So here you probably need a metric of what means failed, what means successful, what is more harm than good, a couple of reasons for arguing for your side. And then another example is there with the do more harm than good as well. There's also policy debates with "this house believes that." When worded as "this house believes that X should do Y." Like Singapore government should abolish the mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking. So here, the Singapore government should do something. While modeling is not mandatory, it definitely could be useful, since in many ways it's a policy motion, you're changing the world, and that's why it can really strengthen your arguments. The second type is "this house would." So here, if you see that W, it means that you're going to change something like a policy. Not mandatory to have a policy model, but definitely is very common. Almost all teams do have models in "this house would" debates. And that proposition fiat that we talked about is very important here. For example, this house would legalize all recreational drugs. Very basic, foundational, "this house would" motion. Number three, this house as X would do Y. So here we have those actor motions we mentioned. The debate happens from the specific perspective of the actor specified in the motion. So all of your brainstorming for the arguments must be linked to why that specific actor would benefit from doing that specific action. That does not mean that actor X is always self-interested or that principal arguments cannot be made. Always think about actor motions as nuanced, like everything in the world is. People don't always act in their self-interest. People don't always act very intelligently. So yeah. just means this kind of motion just means that you have to show why that actor cares about a specific perspective that you're pushing. So this involves a lot of characterizations and describing what the actor is, what they like, what are their motivations, and so on. So here we have an example. This house, as a parent, would encourage their child not to attend Oxbridge. Perhaps you should tell me more about who those parents are generally. What are their motivations? What is the relationship they have with their child? Perhaps what can we assume is their socioeconomic position, and so on. Moving on, we also have certain motions that are named, this house believes that X should do Y, or this house as X would do Y. So we can compare these two right now. Let's start off with the first one. This house believes that X should do Y. So here it's a value judgment debate. And whose perspective is the debate from? Just a neutral party, a third-party observer. Although, of course, the interests of the actor can be prioritized from the perspective of a neutral third-party observer. It's basically whatever is most strategic for you, you should do that. And the model is not mandatory, only if you wanted to do it. This house as X would do Y is an actor motion. So you're purely debating from that actor's perspective, what is the best for them. And once again, the model is not mandatory. Moving on, this house supports or opposes something. So here we also have value judgment principle debates. In these kind of debates, you should assume that we're in the status quo. You don't need to reimagine worlds, but simply support or oppose a specific thing in the context of the world today. You need to explain why having more or less of something is good for the world. So, of course, it might be beneficial to have a metric. At what point do we support or oppose something? Is something inherently bad or good? What are the metrics we usually use to judge things? The example is this house supports the rise of hashtag activism or opposes that same thing. What about this house regrets? What a lot of beginner debaters do is believe that, and intuitively this might make sense, that this house opposes is similar to this house regrets because the wordings are quite similar. However, they're very different actually. So this is important to remember. This house regrets is retrospective. So basically, you don't exactly judge the debate as you're in the status quo. You try to hit a stop on the flow of time and ask if X is something that was good or bad for the world. Or rather, what always helped me is trying to imagine what the world would have looked like if X never existed, whatever that might be. Proposition then needs to reimagine what a world without X would look like. And this reimagined world is called the counterfactual. They must show why this counterfactual is preferable to the status quo. Counterfactuals can be contested, of course. Oppositions may claim that the proposition's counterfactual is not likely, not possible, and of course, they can argue that the status quo is way better. An example of this house regrets the rise of Twitter journalism. What about this house prefers? So it can also be different variants of this. This house prefers X to Y is a principal debate. It's a comparison between two things. Proposition must defend X, opposition must defend Y, and opposition cannot defend plus, like, both of those things, basically. Teams can be quite dynamic in their analysis, so they can show how X and or Y can and has changed over time. An example of this house prefers benevolent dictatorships to weak democracies. So, of course, here examples are key. And you can, of course, show how both of these state formations have a lot of nuances and different examples around the world, and how they're not stagnant but change over time. Another variant is this house prefers a world where X. So here it's kind of a this house regrets motion, in that the proposition needs to establish a counterfactual as well of what the world would have looked like if X would have happened. So it's kind of the reverse of this house regrets. And opposition needs to defend the status quo as previously in the this house regrets example. An example of this motion would be this house prefers a world where all countries were benevolent dictatorships. Now, let's talk about some of the key and often made mistakes about defining motions, and just something that you shouldn't do. The first thing is swirling. That means distorting the topic and defining it in a way that violates the spirit of the motion. The spirit of the motion is a funny term, but basically, with that example, maybe it will make more sense. So let's take the example of this house would ban gambling. When we see this motion, we intuitively kind of know or assume what it means. Of course, if you're a smarty pants, you might think to yourself, I will just define this motion as not actual gambling, but as like taking hard drugs, something risky, or gambling with one's life. Of course, that might help you win, but then the spirit of the motion and what we intuitively believe the motion is about is not really what you're debating. So try to not make the debate easy for yourself. Go with what the debate is actually about, and just try to do your best that you can, even if the topic seems very hard. The second mistake is disallowing opposition room for debate. So this is quite similar. If you're debating about supporting cosmetic surgery, you cannot say that you only support it for people who have been burn victims or have scars or something. It's really hard for opposition then to make any arguments. So once again, don't try to debate the motion as it is a very narrow definition of it. Try to include as many actors as possible so that your arguments in case are actually strong and logically consistent with many different cases. Number 3, refusing to debate the motion at the level of specificity/abstraction the motion requires. Let's understand this through an example. In this house would restrict civil liberties in the name of national security. A definition that defends exclusively compulsory IDs is too narrow. It can be an example of a national security policy, but the debate definitely extends beyond this example to a more general principle. So you cannot say that we would only restrict civil liberties as in compulsory IDs, right? Since this would also kind of make the debate too easy for one side. Number 4, place setting, narrowing the debate down to a specific place when it's not specified by the motion. So banning commercial surrogacy, for example, You cannot say that you would do that only in low-income countries. It should be global. But if the debate does specify a specific place, like this house would ban non-democratic countries from hosting international sporting events, of course, then you have the right to identify what constitutes a democracy for you and what countries, name a few examples, would be basically excluded from hosting international sporting events. And last of all, time setting. So similarly, narrowing the debate down to a specific time. So here, let's see again an example. This House believes that citizens should engage in civil disobedience to protest unjust laws. So of course, you cannot define this policy in the context of apartheid only. You can use it as an example, but it should kind of apply as a broader principle in many different instances. However, once again, if you have a very specific motion about NATO not withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, of course, then you can debate about that specific time frame because it's kind of assumed in the motion. What can you do when you encounter unreasonable definitions? Because this will happen, especially like if you're opposition, you're listening to proposition first, and they're really making the debate easy for themselves. So what can you do? Number one, accept that definition and debate with that definition. You can, of course, say that it's unreasonable, but basically just accept it and move on. Second of all, you can broaden the debate back to the words in the motion. So use your rebuttal skills, which we will learn about next week, to basically say that this is unreasonable. The spirit of the motion requires us to debate about general meanings. And then you can challenge the definition. So you can, with reasonable rebuttal, then present an alternative reasonable definition. Or argue that definition is unreasonable. And this is some extra skills, basically. But also you can argue that even if prop's definition is reasonable, their case is still flawed. What's important, though, is that options 1 and 2 can be done in any speaker's speech, but option 3 must be done in the first opposition speech. In general, to be honest, I would recommend to do definitions, any kind of definitions in the first speech anyways, because then you have more time to have a quality debate on like the definitions that you actually believe on, because that's what the arguments stand on. So if you can do that in the first speech, but of course, this is just like the general guideline. If you don't do it in the first speech, you can do it 1 and 2 in the other speeches. Now we will move on to models, framing, stances, and definitions. And I will take a sip of water, just a second. So when you get a debate motion, a lot of things are going through your mind. But one of the first things that you need to do is the things that we'll learn right now. So models, as we've mentioned, are not required in every single topic, but you have to know them because they're useful for most topics. So basically, the motion is kind of explaining what exactly is it that you would change as proposition and how. Just like if you're implementing a new law, you would probably have some guidelines as what it looks like. And there's an example on the slide as well. This House would is usually like the model motion phrasing that is commonly used. But once again, you can use models in other motions as well. if it's this house believes that, sometimes you definitely need a model. And you have to sort of feel it out. If intuitively you think that the motion is proposing a change or needs extra explanation of how that change would enact, having a model is quite beneficial to you. Let's see the motion, this house would ban smoking, as an example. So here, a motion is quite beneficial. And what's always good to do, as just a tip, is instead of trying to think of just completely new laws yourself, think of laws that already exist in society or something similar to them. So if you want to ban smoking, the thing that comes to mind for many of us probably is the ban on marijuana. That's already implemented in many countries, right? So you could just, in your model, juxtapose the ban of smoking tobacco on the ban of marijuana. So obviously, that means buying, selling, consuming would become a crime, irrespective of how old you are, or other considerations. What is a stance? A stance is similar to a model, but mostly associated with value motions or the motions that don't require a policy change or like a model, basically. The role of a stance is to limit the debate from extreme cases and just overall kind of explain what is your broad goal in this debate and what do you stand for. So let's see a couple of examples here. This house believes that single parents who are imprisoned should be allowed to raise their children in prison. So here, it is reasonable for you to outframe violent criminals like murderers and instead make the debate about nonviolent offenders, which still make up probably a majority of the prison population. They can also, in their reasonable fiat, claim the conditions of prison will be adapted to raising children. Of course, you cannot like create a utopia, but you can reasonably say that probably, the rooms would need to be changed. There would be children's areas to play and to educate them and so on. So this is in the fiat of proposition, and this is their stance. But of course, it's not as if the proposition, like if they create a very unreasonable definition or stance, it can definitely be challenged by opposition and rebutted. And the opposition can claim that it's unreasonable and won't happen in reality or shouldn't happen. A stance can also define what policies outside the scope of the debate your side would support. So if you're talking about privatizing schools in the motion, you could say that while we would privatize schools, we would still keep scholarships for talented, underprivileged children who perhaps don't have the funds to go to private schools. So this is just a reasonable claim that you could keep. And what is framing? So framing is even broader than everything we've talked about here. So when you think about motions and debates, there's always subjectivity in the context of the motion. In debates, we learn that we can argue about topics from two completely different ways, and we can describe something as polar opposites, even when we're talking about the same thing. So framing is basically doing that to our advantage, right? We would describe the context of a debate in a way that suits your case, in a way that strengthens your arguments. Of course, we cannot be too unrealistic. We have to be nuanced. We have to be charitable to the other team, but we should frame the debate and describe the people existing in the debate in a way that's favorable to us. So of course, Some examples of this could be if we want to ban something like tobacco, we would depict that as a very bad thing and how it leads to horrible consequences and so on. If we want to say that something is good or give extra power to it, we would depict it as good and say how it has helped people and so on. So if we are debating about taxing billionaires more as a motion, some of the first questions that we should be answering to ourselves without even thinking about the arguments is about the framing of billionaires, right? So are these billionaires good or bad people? I'm sure that depends on what side you're on. You would be able to describe them as good and bad. So use that to your advantage. You can think about, is their money acquired in an ethical way? How do billionaires usually become rich? What does that process look like? And does that money mean much to them? This is where the consideration of taxation comes in. So think about these things. Answering questions about characterizations and framing can then help you brainstorm good arguments because you have a quite solid foundation to lay them on. Are there any questions about anything in this presentation?